A doctor signed the wrong order. Dorothy saw it first, but in 1957, a nurse could get in trouble for being right too loudly. The patient in room 9 had a history of kidney problems. The dose on the chart did not account for that. Dorothy could not correct the doctor in front of the patient. She could not sound like she was questioning his judgment. So what did she do? The answer comes in Rule 5. But to understand why Rule 5 existed, you have to start with the rules Dorothy learned before she ever became a nurse. 5:55 in the morning. Dorothy stood in the locker room at Barnes Hospital, St. Louis. She fastened her gold pin above her left breast, straightened her collar, looked down at her shoes. She was 20 years old. She had spent 3 years inside this hospital. At 5:58, she walked out of the locker room and onto the floor. Rule 9. She signed when she was 17. 1954. The kitchen table of Dorothy's family home in St. Louis. On the table was the admission contract for the Barnes Hospital nursing program. Her mother stood behind her, reading over her shoulder. They signed it together. There was a clause on page 3. During the 3 years of training, Dorothy was not permitted to marry. If she married, she would be dismissed from the program immediately. No refund, no exceptions. 3 years. From 17 to 20 years old. Her schedule, her curfew, and whether she could marry, written into the contract she had just signed. In the 1950s, many hospital nursing programs still included rules like this. In exchange, student nurses received a stipend. At some hospitals, $15 a month. At others, nothing at all. On her first day as a graduate nurse, there was a rule she had not been taught in the classroom. Rule 8. Doctors were doctor, nurses were nurse. On her first day, Dorothy passed Dr. Henderson at a patient room door. She said, "Good morning, Mr. Henderson." That afternoon, in the hallway near the linen closet, the head nurse said one sentence. "He is Dr. Henderson," then walked away. Dorothy never got it wrong again. In American hospitals in the 1950s, the way names were used followed a clear pattern. Doctors were always doctor, followed by last name. An intern 3 weeks out of medical school was doctor. A nurse with 10 years of experience was still nurse. It sounded small. It was not.
Rule 7. Every narcotic had to be accounted for. At the end of the medical surgical hallway, there was a locked steel cabinet. Inside, morphine, Demerol, sedatives. The key hung on the charge nurse's belt. When Dorothy needed a dose for a patient, she had to bring a second nurse. Unlock the cabinet, write her name, the patient's name, the dose, and the time. In ink. The second nurse signed below. At the end of the shift, the count had to match the book. No screen, no barcode, only ink, signatures, and the count at the end of the shift. If one tablet was missing, just one, the supervisor was called. The pharmacy was notified. The 2 nurses who had last signed stayed past their clock out to account for every line. Every nurse on that floor signed carefully, every time. But medication was not the only thing that had to add up. Dorothy's time did too. Rule 6. The shift ended on paper, not on the floor. Dorothy's shift was scheduled 6 in the morning to 2 in the afternoon. She never left at 2. At the end of each shift, she gave report to the oncoming nurse. The condition of every patient, medications given, medications pending, anyone who needed close watching. 20 minutes, sometimes 30. Not a minute of it counted toward her pay. Not a minute appeared on the timesheet. If the charts weren't finished, she stayed to finish them, also unpaid. The night shift ran at a different volume. After 10 in the evening, whispers, soft-soled shoes, a flashlight instead of the overhead light. Linda Richards, often recognized as America's first trained nurse, graduated in 1873. Soon after, she worked nights at Bellevue, where the gas was turned so low she could barely see the patients' faces, only the dim shapes of figures under gray blankets. In 1957, the flashlight replaced the gas lamp. The instruction hadn't changed in 84 years. If you've made it this far, hit like so stories like this one can reach more people. Rule 5, she could not correct a doctor directly. Back to room 9. Dorothy had read the order twice. The dose was higher than she believed was safe for a patient with a history of kidney problems. She did not walk into the room and say so. She went into the hallway. She waited for Dr. Mills to come out. Then she said, "Dr. Mills, I want to make sure I'm reading the order for room 9 correctly. The patient has a kidney history. Does the dosage account for that?" Dr. Mills stopped. He looked back at the chart. He revised the order. That division was not just custom. It was how hospital practice worked. The physician wrote the order. The nurse carried it out, which meant that when something looked wrong, the path from observation to correction had to run through the doctor, not around him. A nurse who challenged an order directly in front of a patient did not do it a second time. The schedule could change the following week. The performance review could reflect it, and a future employer would ask for a reference from the same hospital. The skill Dorothy used in that hallway had no name in any textbook, but every nurse on that floor knew how to use it. Dorothy could be right. She just had to be right quietly. Rule 4. The pay envelope. At the end of the month, Dorothy picked up her pay envelope at the office on the ground floor. She put it in her coat pocket and walked past the medication cabinet she had locked less than an hour earlier. For many civilian hospital nurses in the mid-1950s, the starting wage was at or below $200 a month, comparable to clerical jobs that required no clinical training. Through that decade, the American Nurses Association pushed for nurses to have a stronger voice over wages and working conditions. Many hospitals resisted. That gap between the responsibility and the pay is what Rule 1 is about. Rule 3. The uniform spoke before she did rule. The cap on a nurse's head in 1957 carried specific information. Every nursing school in America had its own design. A black velvet stripe at the base meant graduate nurse. No stripe meant student. A nurse walking down a hallway could be read at 50 feet. Dorothy's shoes were polished every night. A scuff in the morning was a uniform infraction. The head nurse noticed. Dorothy learned that in her first month. She watched another nurse get called back at the door. After that, her shoes were polished every night. Rule 2. What happened when someone spoke too loudly? A nurse on Dorothy's floor said in the break room that handover reports should be paid time. No one argued with her. The following week, her name appeared on 3 consecutive night shifts. A nurse who wanted to transfer to another hospital needed a reference letter from her current employer, signed by the person she had just complained about. Dorothy did not need anyone to explain the lesson. The schedule had already done that. Rule 1. The work was called a calling. In 1893, Listra Greta wrote what became the Florence Nightingale Pledge. The words every graduating nurse stood up and read aloud. One line said, "Aid the physician in his work." Dorothy read those words after 3 years in the Barnes program. 3 years spent mostly inside the hospital that ran the school, working on real patients, on real floors, for a stipend that barely covered personal expenses. In 1948, the Russell Sage Foundation recommended moving nursing education out of hospitals and into universities. That recommendation was ignored for nearly 20 years. The American Nurses Association said the same thing in 1965. But for Dorothy's generation, nursing was still called a calling, and a calling came with different expectations than an ordinary job. That word shaped the contract on the kitchen table, the unpaid minutes after the shift, the question Dorothy asked outside room 9. 2:17 in the afternoon. Dorothy was still on the floor. The medication log was locked. A grey scuff marked her right shoe. On the duty board, her name still sat below the doctor's. At Barnes, that was just a working day. Dorothy stayed in nursing for many years after that. What her generation built is still inside every American hospital today. Medication protocols, handover systems, patient records, and the quiet habit of noticing what changed overnight. They were the ones in the room at 3 in the morning, the ones who caught what the chart missed, the ones who knew the patient's name before the physician walked in. That kind of knowledge does not come from a textbook. It comes from years of showing up, paying attention, and caring enough to get it right. They did it with a pin, a cap, a logbook, and a key on a belt. If this brought back a memory, a mother, an aunt, a grandmother, a wife, or any nurse who came home with the smell of antiseptic still on her hands, share this with someone who would remember. Subscribe to Old American Unspoken. There's more forgotten history waiting. Thank you.